The recorder sat silently on the table between them. Its single red indicator blinked steadily in the dim room, counting the seconds like a heartbeat. Keithall stared at it for a long time. Long enough for the young journalist to wonder if the interview was about to end before it even began. Finally, the old veteran lifted his gaze. His compound eyes settled on the reporter seated across from him. The journalist was young, very young, barely past his final growth cycle. His posture radiated excitement. His datapad was already open. Questions waited behind eager eyes. Keithall recognized that look. He had seen it countless times over the years. The look of someone who knew war only through history records and heroic documentaries. Someone searching for legends, for victories, for tales of brave warriors and glorious battles. The old veteran almost laughed. Almost. Because there had been nothing glorious about that war. Nothing heroic. Nothing worth celebrating. Only survival. And far too many graves. Keithall slowly leaned back in his chair. Ancient joints protested the movement. The reinforced plates of his aging exoskeleton creaked softly, carrying the weight of injuries that had never fully healed. Deep scars carved across his chest armor, where plasma fire had once burned through layers of protection. One of his lower arms ended in a cybernetic replacement, polished but unmistakably artificial. The journalist's eyes drifted toward the old wounds. Keithall noticed. They always did. Most assumed the scars were trophies. Proof of courage. Proof of victory. They were wrong. The scars were receipts. Proof of mistakes he had survived. Proof of friends who hadn't. The room remained silent, except for the faint hum of the recorder. The young reporter finally cleared his throat. "Commander Keithall," he began carefully, "the archives say you were present during first contact with humanity." The veteran's expression darkened immediately. Not anger. Something deeper. Something colder. A memory. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked back at the blinking red light on the recorder, watching it pulse. Once. Twice. 3 times. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than the stars outside the window. "The archives," he said quietly, "are missing most of what happened." The journalist leaned forward. Keithall's compound eyes narrowed. "If you're here looking for stories about conquest," he continued, "you should leave now." The young reporter froze. The veteran folded his scarred hands on the table. "Because the day we met humans..." He paused, and for the first time since entering the room, genuine unease crossed his face. Was the day the galaxy learned that being peaceful and being harmless are not the same thing. The recorder continued blinking. The journalist forgot to breathe, and Keithall began telling the story he had spent 40 years trying to forget. White lines against the dark green of his natural armor. His left arm ended at the elbow, a wound that no medical technology could repair. He was old now, 30 cycles past the war, and every one of those cycles showed in the way he carried himself. "You want to know about the humans?" Keith said. His voice was rough, damaged by years of screaming in his sleep. "Everyone wants to know about the humans." The journalist leaned forward with excitement in his eyes. "The archives say your unit was among the first to make ground contact. You were there from the beginning." "I was there," Keith agreed. He reached for the cup of bitter tea on the table and wrapped his remaining claw around it. The warmth felt good against his old joints. "I was young then, stupid, eager for combat like you are eager for stories." He paused and looked out the window at the gray sky of the Vitoran homeworld. Somewhere out there, past the clouds and the void of space, the humans were still living their lives, building their cities, raising their children. They had moved on from the war, the Valorans had not. "Tell me about the beginning," the journalist said. "Tell me about Target 7. Keith closed his eyes. Even after all these years, he could still see it perfectly. The fleet dropping out of faster-than-light travel, the blue and green world hanging in the blackness of space, the confident voices of his fellow soldiers as they prepared for an easy victory. "We called it Target 7, he said slowly. "The humans called it New Montana. It was a farming colony on the edge of their territory. Maybe 50,000 humans living there, growing food, raising animals. The High Command chose it because it was isolated, far from Earth, far from help." He opened his eyes and looked at the journalist. We thought it would be simple. Land, conquer, move on. The humans were primitive. They had only been traveling between stars for 200 of their years. We had been doing it for thousands. Our weapons were superior. Our ships were faster. Our soldiers were stronger. The journalist was writing quickly on his datapad. The reports say the invasion force was impressive. 12 warships. Keith confirmed. 4,000 ground troops. Enough firepower to crack a small moon. All for a farming colony. He let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it had any joy in it. We could have conquered their entire world with that force. Or so we believed. He remembered standing on the observation deck as the fleet approached New Montana. General Voresh had given a speech about the glory of the Empire, about how the humans would fall like all the others had fallen. 11 species had already bent their knees to the Valoran Empire. The humans would be the 12th. I was a lieutenant then, Keith continued. Young, proud. I had trained my whole life for combat, and this was my first real mission. I remember looking at the planet and feeling almost sorry for the creatures living there. Sorry, the journalist asked. We intercepted their communications as we approached. Radio signals, television broadcasts. Keith's voice grew quiet. I heard their music. I heard them laughing. I heard their children talking to each other, playing games, singing songs. They had no idea we were coming. No idea that their lives were about to end. He set down his teacup and stared at the table. I told myself it was necessary. The Empire needed resources. The Empire needed to expand. These humans were simply in the way. The journalist shifted uncomfortably. And then you landed. First we observed. We sent drones to study their settlements. We watched them for 3 rotations, learning their patterns, identifying their defenses. Keith shook his head. They had almost no military presence. A few local security officers with primitive projectile weapons, some hunting rifles that the farmers used for pest control. Nothing that could threaten our forces. He remembered the briefing before the landing. General Vormesh had stood before the assembled troops with a map of the main settlement displayed behind him. The general was tall and proud, his exoskeleton polished to a shine, medals covering his chest. The general told us we would be done in 3 rotations, Keith said. Land, secure the population centers, establish control. He said the humans would surrender immediately once they saw our superior force. He said they were a reasonable species, that they would understand resistance was pointless, but that is not what happened, the journalist said. Keith was quiet for a long moment. Outside, rain began to fall against the window. The sound of it filled the silence between them. No, he finally said. That is not what happened. He reached into his carrying pouch and pulled out a piece of paper. It was old and worn, the edges soft from years of handling. He unfolded it carefully and placed it on the table. The journalist leaned forward to look. It was a drawing made with colored wax sticks, the kind that human children used. Simple shapes formed a picture of 4 figures standing in front of a house. A tall male figure, a female figure, and 2 smaller figures that were clearly children. Above them, a yellow sun smiled down from a blue sky. I found this in one of the houses, Keith said. On the first day, the family who lived there was already gone. They had fled with the others into the wilderness, but they left this behind. He touched the drawing gently with one claw. I have kept it for 30 cycles. I look at it every day. Why? The journalist asked. Keith looked up at him with something ancient and terrible in his eyes. To remind myself of what we tried to destroy, and to remind myself of how badly we failed. He pulled the drawing back toward himself and held it in his remaining hand. We thought we were the predators coming to hunt the prey. We had conquered 11 species. We had never been defeated. We believed we understood war. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. We had no idea what predators truly looked like. We had no idea what we had awakened. And by the time we understood, it was far too late. The journalist sat in silence, his datapad forgotten in his hands. The rain continued to fall outside, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the gray sky. Tell me, he finally said. Tell me what happened when you landed. Keith folded the drawing carefully and placed it back in his pouch. Then he looked at the journalist with eyes that had seen too much and could never unsee it. Very well, he said. I will tell you about the day we met the humans. I will tell you about the day we learned what fear truly means. He reached for his tea again and took a long drink. His claw trembled slightly as he set the cup back down. It began in silence, he said. That is what I remember most about the first day. The terrible, terrible silence. The dropships fell from the sky like metal rain. Keith stood among his fellow soldiers in the cargo hold, feeling the vibration of atmospheric entry through his boots. Through the small viewport, he could see the ground rushing up to meet them. Green fields, small buildings, roads cutting through the landscape like gray ribbons. The settlement was called Riverside by the humans, a small farming community of perhaps 3,000 people. It would be their first conquest on this new world. General Vorish's voice came through the communication system. All units, prepare for landing. Secure the town center. Round up any humans you find. Minimal casualties if possible. We need workers. The ship touched down with a heavy thud. The cargo doors opened, and bright sunlight flooded in. Keith raised his weapon and moved forward with his unit, stepping onto human soil for the first time. The air smelled strange, sweet, almost like growing things in clean water. A gentle breeze moved through the tall grass around the landing zone. Birds sang in the trees nearby. Unaware of what was happening below them, Cathro looked around at the peaceful scene and felt a moment of unease. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, though he could not say what it was. Move out, his squad leader ordered. Formation Delta. Watch your sectors. They advanced toward the town in a standard sweep pattern. 40 soldiers in full combat armor, carrying plasma rifles capable of burning through steel. They were trained, equipped, and confident. Nothing on this primitive world could stand against them. The first buildings they reached were small homes made of wood and stone. Keith noticed flowers growing in boxes beneath the windows. Children's toys scattered in the yards. A ground vehicle sat in one driveway, its doors still open, as if the owner had left in a hurry. Check the structures, the squad leader commanded. Keith moved to the nearest house and pushed open the door. Inside, he found a scene that would stay with him forever. The morning meal was still on the table, half eaten. Steam still rose from cups of dark liquid. A book lay open on a chair, its pages stirring in the breeze from the open door. The humans had been here moments ago. They had fled so quickly they had left everything behind. Structure clear, Keith reported. No contacts. They ran. Similar reports came from across the settlement. Every house was empty. Every building abandoned. The entire population had vanished like smoke in the wind. They knew we were coming, someone said over the communications channel. How did they know? General Vorish's voice cut through the chatter. It does not matter. They cannot have gone far. Expand the search. Find them. Keith's unit moved deeper into the town. The main street was lined with small businesses. A food shop. A place where humans repaired their machines. A building with large windows displaying clothing. Everything was silent and still. Then Keith noticed movement in the corner of his eye. He turned toward it, raising his weapon. A small animal, furry and four-legged, was walking calmly across the street. It stopped and looked at him with curious eyes, then continued on its way without any sign of fear. Keith watched it go. Why would the humans leave their animals behind? What were they planning? The answer came without warning. The soldier walking 3 steps ahead of Keithall suddenly fell. There was no sound, no flash of light, nothing to indicate an attack. One moment he was standing. The next moment he was on the ground with a hole through his chest plate. Contact, someone screamed. We have contact, but there was no one to see, no enemy to fight, just empty buildings and silent streets. Another soldier fell, then another, each one dropped by an invisible force that punched through their armor like it was made of paper. Where are they? The squad leader shouted. Find the shooters. Keith dove behind a ground vehicle for cover. His hearts were pounding so hard he could hear them in his ears. He scanned the buildings around him, looking for any sign of the attackers. Nothing, just windows and doors and shadows. A sharp crack echoed across the town, and the soldier next to Keith jerked backward with a spray of green blood. The shot had come from somewhere to the north, but when Keith looked in that direction, he saw only an empty hillside covered in tall grass. Retreat, the squad leader ordered. Fall back to the landing zone, they ran. The mighty soldiers of the Valoran Empire, conquerors of 11 species, ran from an enemy they could not see. More shots rang out as they fled, each one finding its target. With terrible precision, Keithall made it to the edge of town before he finally saw one of the attackers. It was a human male, old by their standards, with gray hair and weathered skin. He stood in the doorway of a large building that smelled of animals. In his hands was a long weapon made of wood and metal. He was watching the Valorans retreat with cold, steady eyes. For a moment, their gazes met. Keith raised his plasma rifle, but before he could fire, the human was gone. He had stepped back into the shadows and vanished like a ghost. Later, Kethril would learn that the human's name was Greg Dawson. He was a farmer. He raised animals and grew plants for food. He had never been a soldier, never received military training, never fought in any war. But on that day, Greg Dawson and his daughter Katie killed 18 Vatoran soldiers with weapons designed for hunting animals. They moved through the town like spirits, appearing only long enough to fire a single shot before disappearing again. The Taurans did not understand. How could farmers fight like this? How could people with no training, no real weapons, no armor, cause so much damage to a professional military force? Keith made it back to the landing zone with 7 other survivors of his 40-soldier unit. He collapsed against the side of a dropship and tried to control his breathing. His hands would not stop shaking. General Vorsh arrived an hour later to assess the situation. His face was twisted with rage as he looked at the reports. Over 200 Veltoran soldiers had been killed or wounded in the first day of the invasion. They had not captured a single human. "Bring in the heavy weapons," the general ordered. "Burn the town to the ground." They did. They fired plasma cannons at the buildings until nothing remained but ash and melted glass. They scorched the fields and poisoned the wells. They turned Riverside into a blackened wasteland, but the humans were already gone. They had melted into the wilderness, carrying their weapons and their wounded and their children. They had left nothing behind except empty buildings and a lesson that the Valorans had not yet understood. That night, Keith sat in the temporary camp and stared at the crayon drawing he had taken from the abandoned house. The happy family, the smiling sun, the simple home that was now nothing but ashes. He thought about the old human farmer with his primitive weapon and his cold eyes. He thought about how quickly everything had gone wrong. He thought about the soldiers he had trained with, eaten with, laughed with, now lying dead in the streets of a destroyed town. And for the first time in his life, Keith felt something he had never felt before. It took him years to find the word for it, but eventually he did. Fear. Real fear. Not the fear of death, which every soldier knows. Something deeper. Something worse. The fear of facing an enemy that would not break, would not surrender, would not stop fighting no matter what was done to them. The humans had lost their town. They had lost their homes, their possessions, their peaceful lives. Any other species would have surrendered after such destruction. Any other species would have begged for mercy. But when Keith looked into the darkness beyond the camp lights, he knew the humans were out there watching, waiting, planning. They were just getting started. The wilderness of New Montana stretched for thousands of kilometers in every direction. Dense forests, steep mountains, deep valleys carved by ancient rivers. The humans had fled into this vastness, and now the Taurans had to follow. Keith's unit was assigned to the eastern search sector. They marched through the forest in tight formation, sensors scanning for any sign of human life. The trees here were massive, taller than any building on the Valuran homeworld. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in scattered beams, creating patches of gold on the dark forest floor. On the third day, they found an abandoned camp, shelters made from fabric and branches, the remains of cooking fires, medical supplies scattered on the ground, as if dropped in a hurry. The humans had been here recently, but once again, they had vanished before the Taurans could arrive. "How do they keep moving?" one of the soldiers asked. "They have wounded. They have children. They should not be able to stay ahead of us." No one had an answer. By the 5th day, the Veltoran forces had cut off most escape routes. They had poisoned the main water sources. They had destroyed the human supply caches. Logic said the humans should surrender now. They had no food, no clean water, no medicine. They were hunted and surrounded. But the humans did not surrender. Instead, they started hunting back. It happened at night mostly. A guard would disappear from his post, found later with his throat cut and his weapon taken. Tripwires connected to explosives made from farming chemicals. Pits, dug into forest paths lined with sharpened sticks. Every step became dangerous. Every shadow held potential death. Keith stopped sleeping. None of them could sleep. Every time they closed their eyes, they imagined human hands reaching for them in the darkness. The soldiers began to jump at every sound. Branches cracking, birds calling, wind moving through the leaves. Everything became a threat. On the 8th day, Keith's patrol captured a human. His name was Pete Novak. He was a man of middle years with a short beard and hard eyes. When they found him, he had 2 bullet wounds in his torso, a broken arm, and had not eaten or drunk anything in 3 days. He was still fighting when they subdued him. It took 6 soldiers to bring him down, and he injured 2 of them before they could bind his hands. The interrogation happened in a clearing near the main camp. General Voresh came personally to oversee it. He stood before the wounded human with his arms crossed and his expression full of contempt. "Where are the others hiding?" the general demanded. "Tell us, and we will treat your wounds. We will give you food and water. You will live." Pete Novak looked up at him with blood running down his face, and then he did something that made no sense at all. He laughed. It was not a nervous laugh or a crazy laugh. It was a real laugh, full of genuine amusement, as if the general had told a funny joke. "You don't understand anything, do you?" Pete said. His voice was rough from thirst, but there was no weakness in it. "You think you're winning because you have more ships and bigger guns. You think we're going to give up because things got hard. He spit blood onto the ground near the general's feet. "My grandmother survived a famine that killed 10 million people. My grandfather fought in a war where 50 million died. My father was in a conflict where people strapped bombs to their own bodies and walked into enemy camps." Pete smiled, showing teeth stained red. "You burned our town. You poisoned our water. You think that makes us want to surrender?" He leaned forward as far as his bonds would allow. "It makes us want to kill every single one of you. And we will. Every single one." The general ordered him taken away, but Pete's words had done their damage. Keith saw the fear spreading through the soldiers who had witnessed the interrogation. They had expected the human to beg, to break, to give them the information they wanted. Instead, he had promised them death while bleeding from multiple wounds and laughing in their faces. The next day, the attacks increased. A human medic named Laura Simmons led the Valorans into a trap. She had been found near a refugee camp, treating the wounded. When the soldiers moved in to capture her, she triggered a landslide that buried half the patrol. Then, she picked up a fallen soldier's weapon and killed 4 more before escaping into the forest. She was protecting children, human children, too young and sick to move quickly. She had refused to abandon them. Even when she knew the soldiers were coming, she had chosen to fight instead of run. Keith could not understand it. On his world, if a battle was lost, you retreated. You surrendered. You lived to fight another day. But these humans seemed not to care about their own survival. They would rather die than abandon their weak. 3 days later, an elderly human named Howard Bell drove a stolen ground transport into the Valoran ammunition depot. The vehicle was loaded with explosives. The blast killed 30 soldiers and destroyed supplies that would take weeks to replace. Keith was close enough to see Howard's face through the vehicle's window in the moment before impact. The old man was smiling, not a crazy smile, a peaceful smile. The smile of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and had made peace with it. That night, General Voresh began drinking. He sat alone in his command tent with a bottle of Vitoran spirits and did not speak to anyone. Through the fabric walls, Keith could hear him muttering, "The eyes," the general was saying. "Their eyes. They never stop watching, never stop hunting, even when they're running, even when they're dying. The eyes." Keith thought about Pete Novak's eyes as he laughed, about Laura Simmons's eyes as she triggered the landslide, about Howard Bell's eyes as he drove to his death. The general was right. There was something in those eyes that did not exist in any other species the Valorans had conquered. The old Velian philosophers had a concept called soul weight. It was the measure of a being's will to survive, to fight, to continue existing against all obstacles. Most species had limited soul weight. Push them hard enough and they would break. Looking into the darkness of the forest that night, listening to the distant sounds of humans moving through the trees, Keith realized something that changed his understanding of the universe forever. Humans had infinite soul weight. They simply did not accept death. Not because they did not understand it, but because they refused to acknowledge its power over them. They would fight wounded. They would fight outnumbered. They would fight until their bodies physically could not continue. And then they would find ways to keep fighting anyway. Keith's people were strong. They were fast. They had better technology and better weapons. But they did not have whatever fire burned inside these strange, soft creatures from a small planet called Earth. And standing there in the darkness, surrounded by soldiers who had not slept in days, Keith began to understand that they were not going to win this war. They had awakened something that could not be put back to sleep, something that would follow them across space and time until one side or the other was completely destroyed, and he was no longer certain which side that would be. On the 23rd day of the invasion, the scanners detected ships entering the system, human ships coming fast from the direction of Earth. General Vorish stood in the command center of the flagship, watching the tactical display with bloodshot eyes. He had not slept properly in weeks. The bottle was never far from his hand now. But when he saw the human fleet, some of the old arrogance returned to his voice. 12 ships, he said. Only 12. We have the same number, and our vessels are superior in every way. Alert the fleet. We will destroy them in orbit, and then finish the ground campaign. Keith was on the surface when the battle began. He watched the sky light up with flashes of weapons, fire, and exploding ships. The ground troops stopped their operations and stared upward, waiting to see their fleet crush the human response. The battle lasted 4 hours. At first, it seemed like the general was right. The Vitoran ships were larger, better armed, and better armored. They destroyed 2 human vessels in the opening exchange, burning them out of the sky with concentrated plasma fire. But then, Admiral Nancy Park showed the Valorans how humans fight in space. The human commander did not follow the rules of void warfare that every civilized species knew. She did not form battle lines. She did not exchange salvos at proper distance. She did not accept defeat when her ships were damaged. Instead, she attacked with a fury that defied understanding. Human ships rammed Velian vessels, destroying both in massive explosions. Damaged human cruisers continued to fire even as they broke apart, their crews staying at their stations until the very end. Admiral Park ordered her ships to create debris fields from their own destroyed vessels, then used those fields to hide ambush attacks. One human destroyer, its engines destroyed, and its hull breached in multiple places, drifted toward a Taurian battleship while broadcasting a surrender signal. When the Taurans moved to capture it, the destroyer detonated its reactor core at point-blank range. The crew had known they were going to die. They had chosen to take their enemies with them. By the time the battle ended, 8 Veltoran ships were destroyed or crippled. The humans had lost 7 vessels, but they had won control of the orbit, and more importantly, they had landed their marines. Keith first encountered the human ground forces 2 days later. He was leading a patrol through a river valley when they walked into an ambush. But this was different from the attacks by the colonists. This was professional military precision. The first shots took out the soldiers at the front and back of the column, trapping the rest in the kill zone. Then the humans emerged from the trees on both sides of the river. Moving with coordinated grace, their leader was a compact man with a shaved head and calm eyes. He walked through the chaos of the firefight as if taking a peaceful stroll. His name, Keith would later learn, was Sergeant Danny Reeves. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes. When it was over, Keithall was the only still alive. He had been wounded in the leg and could not run. He waited for the humans to kill him. That was what his people would have done. That was what made sense. Instead, Sergeant Danny Reeves walked up to him, kicked his weapon away, and studied him with those strange human eyes. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out a container of water. "Drink," Danny said, holding it out. Keith stared at him. "Why?" "Because you're thirsty." The human's voice was flat, without emotion, and because dead prisoners can't answer questions. The water was cool and clean. Keith drank it all, while human soldiers bound his wounds with their own medical supplies. He could not understand what was happening. These were the same creatures who fought like demons, who never surrendered, who sacrificed themselves without hesitation. Now they were treating his injuries as gently as they would treat one of their own. Danny Reeves crouched down in front of him and asked one question. "Why did you come here?" Keith had no answer. The reasons he had believed in before the invasion seemed hollow now. Resources, expansion, glory. What did any of that mean compared to what he had witnessed? Danny nodded, as if he understood the silence. "That's what I thought," he said. Then he stood up and ordered his soldiers to move out, taking Keithall with them as a prisoner. The human camp was different from anything Keith expected. There was organization and discipline, yes, but there was also laughter, singing, soldiers sharing meals and telling stories. One group was playing a game with a small ball, throwing it back and forth and trying to catch it. How could they be so relaxed? They were in the middle of a war. Their people were dying. Their homes had been destroyed. But watching them, Keith began to understand something about humans that he had missed before. They were not just good at surviving, they were good at living. Even in the worst circumstances, they found ways to be happy, to connect with each other, to create moments of joy in the middle of horror. It was this, perhaps more than their fighting ability, that made them truly dangerous. They could not be broken because they carried their hope with them wherever they went. A woman approached Keith's holding area that evening. She wore the uniform of a military medic, and her name tag read, Ro Beth. She was young, with dark hair pulled back from her face, and gentle hands that checked his wounds with professional care. "You're healing well," she said. "The shot missed anything important." Keith watched her work. "Why are you helping me? I killed your people. I tried to destroy your colony. I tried to destroy your colony." Bethro shrugged as she applied fresh bandages. "You're hurt. I'm a medic. That's what I do. But I am your enemy." She paused and looked at him directly. Her eyes were brown, warm, nothing like the cold fury he had seen in other human faces during battle. "You're a soldier who was following orders," she said quietly. "Most of you probably don't even know why you're really here. Your leaders sent you to die on a planet you'd never heard of, against people who never did anything to you." She finished the bandage and sat back. "That doesn't make me want to help you less. It makes me want to help you more." Keith did not know what to say. This was not how enemies were supposed to treat each other. This was not how war worked. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps humans did not fight war the way other species did. Perhaps they understood something about conflict that the Valorans had never learned. You could hate an enemy, you could kill an enemy, but if you could also show an enemy mercy, you proved that you were fighting for something worth believing in. That night, lying in the prisoner area and listening to the distant sounds of humans singing around their fires, Keith felt something shift inside him. The war was not over. People were still dying. But for the first time since landing on this planet, he did not feel like he was living through a nightmare. He felt like he was finally beginning to wake up. The war ended on the 42nd day with a complete Valoran surrender. General Vorish was found dead in his command bunker, an empty bottle beside him, and his service weapon in his hand. He had taken his own life rather than face the shame of defeat. Many other officers did the same. The proud Velian military, which had conquered 11 species across the galaxy, had been broken by farmers and soldiers from a single human colony. Keith was present at the surrender ceremony, watching from the prisoner holding area as the remaining Valoran commanders signed the agreement. Admiral Nancy Park represented the humans. She stood straight and calm, her uniform crisp despite weeks of combat, her face showing neither triumph nor hatred. The terms of surrender surprised everyone. The Valorans had expected punishment. They had expected demands for resources, territory, perhaps even the subjugation of their homeworld. That was how their empire had operated for generations. The strong took from the weak. The victors claimed their spoils. But the humans asked for none of this. Admiral Park presented only 3 demands. First, formal recognition of human territory and sovereignty. Second, a complete withdrawal of Allen forces. Third, the return of all prisoners on both sides. That was all. No reparations, no territory transfer, no humiliation. One of the commanders, disbelieving, asked why the humans did not demand more. Admiral Park was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke in a voice that carried across the room. "We did not want this war," she said. "We were building homes, raising children, living our lives. You came to take that from us, and we stopped you. That is enough." She paused and something hard entered her eyes. "But understand this clearly. We are not sparing you because we are weak. We are sparing you because we are strong enough to choose mercy. Do not mistake that choice for an invitation to try again." The Veltoran commanders signed the agreement without further argument. The prisoner exchange took 3 days. Keith was among the last to leave. He had been well treated during his captivity, fed the same food as the human soldiers, given medical care when he needed it, even allowed to walk freely within the camp under guard. On his final day on New Montana, Bethro came to see him. She looked tired. The weeks of combat had taken their toll on everyone, but she still had that warmth in her eyes, that strange human kindness that Keith had never seen in any other species. "You're going home," she said. Keith looked at her. "I do not understand you," he admitted. "I do not understand any of your people. You fight like nothing I have ever seen. You never surrender, never stop, never give up. but then you show mercy to those who tried to destroy you. How can both things be true? Beth thought about his question for a while. The sun was setting over the wilderness, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere in the distance, a bird was singing. "We're complicated," she finally said. "Humans are always complicated. We can love and hate at the same time. We can fight and forgive at the same time. We're never just one thing." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something for you. I don't know if your people have anything like letters, but we humans write things down when we want someone to remember." Keith took the paper carefully. "What does it say?" "Open it later. When you're home and trying to make sense of everything that happened." She smiled. A genuine smile with no anger behind it. "I hope you find peace, Keith. I hope your nightmares eventually stop." He wanted to say something meaningful, but no words would come. Instead, he simply nodded and held the letter close as the guards came to escort him to the transport. The journey home was quiet. The other surviving soldiers sat in silence, staring at nothing. Many of them would never speak of what they had experienced. Some would take their own lives in the cycles that followed. The psychological wounds were deeper than any physical injury. Keith read Beth's letter on the third day of the journey. Her handwriting was neat and careful, each word clearly formed. "Dear Keith," it said, "I know you probably don't understand why I helped you. To be honest, I'm not sure I understand it completely myself, but I believe that kindness matters even in war, maybe especially in war. I hope that when you think of humans, you remember more than just the fighting. I hope you remember that we can be gentle too, that we want peace as much as anyone. We just refuse to accept it at the cost of our freedom. Be well, live your life, and if you ever have the chance to show mercy to someone who was once your enemy, I hope you take it." That's how the cycle of hate ends. One choice at a time. With hope, Bethro, Keith folded the letter and placed it in his carrying pouch next to the crayon drawing of the human family. He would carry both items for the rest of his life. 30 cycles had passed since then. Now Keith sat in the Veterans Support Center, his story nearly finished, the young journalist staring at him with wide eyes. The recording device was still running, its red light blinking steadily in the dim room. "The war changed everything," Keith said quietly. "The Valorian Empire never expanded again. We had learned our lesson. We had learned what happens when you threaten beings who would rather die than submit." He reached into his pouch and pulled out the 2 items he had carried for 3 decades. The crayon drawing faded now, the colors soft from years of handling, and the letter from Bethro folded so many times the paper had become soft as cloth. "I look at these every day," he said. "The drawing reminds me of what we tried to destroy. The letter reminds me of what we never expected to find. Well, every T," the journalist leaned forward. "What is that?" "Humanity," Keith said simply. "Not the word, the real thing. The capacity to be terrifying and gentle in equal measure. The ability to fight without mercy, and then offer mercy to the defeated. The strength to never surrender, and the wisdom to not demand submission from others." He placed both items on the table between them. "You asked me what I want people to understand about humans," he continued. "I have thought about this question for 30 cycles, and I have finally found my answer." The journalist waited, his data pad forgotten in his hands. "Humans are not dangerous because they are strong, though they are strong. They are not dangerous because they are smart, though they are smart. They are dangerous because they are complete." Keith's compound eyes met the journalist's gaze. They contain everything within themselves: creation and destruction, love and hate, compassion and violence. They choose which of these to show in any moment, and they move between them as easily as breathing. You never know which human you are facing until it is too late. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his many years. "If your generation ever considers challenging the humans again, remember my words. They do not conquer because they do not need to. They do not destroy because they choose not to. But if you threaten what they love, if you come for their homes and their children and their freedom, they will show you the other side of what they are." His voice dropped to barely a whisper, "And you will not survive it." The journalist sat in silence for a long moment. The rain had stopped outside, and pale sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. "What happened to the humans you knew?" he finally asked. "The ones from New Montana." Keith picked up the letter and held it gently. "I do not know. I never went back. I never tried to find them." He paused. "Perhaps that was a mistake. Perhaps I should have thanked them properly for teaching me what strength really looks like. He stood slowly, his old joints creaking with the movement. The interview was over. He had said everything he needed to say. One more thing, he said as he turned toward the door. Beth Rowe wrote in her letter that kindness matters, even in war, especially in war. He looked back at the journalist with something ancient and sad in his eyes. She was right. The humans taught us many things during those 42 days. But that lesson was the most important. You can judge a species not by how they treat their friends, but by how they treat their enemies. The humans could have destroyed us. They had every right to after what we did. But they let us go home. He touched the letter one final time before placing it back in his pouch. That mercy was the most terrifying thing of all, because it meant they were not fighting out of anger or hatred. They were fighting because they believed in something worth protecting. And beings who fight for belief will never ever stop. The door opened, letting in the pale morning light. "Remember that," Keith said. "Remember them, and pray you never give them a reason to fight again." Then he was gone, walking slowly into the gray morning, carrying his memories and his scars, and his warnings, into whatever years remained to him. Behind him, the young journalist sat alone in the empty room. Staring at the place where Keith had been, the recording device clicked off. The red light stopped blinking, and somewhere across the vast emptiness of space, the humans continued to live their lives, build their homes, and raise their children, waiting as they always waited, to see what the universe would bring them